Welcome to our deep dive into the Magna Carta. We're going to be taking a look at this famous document, specifically through a translation that's been provided by the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration. You might already know it as a historical document from England, signed way back in 1215, but we're going to discover how surprisingly relevant it is to your life today.
That's right. It's much more than just dusty history. The Magna Carta actually laid the groundwork for some of our most fundamental rights and legal principles, even in the modern world.
So we're not just talking about knights and castles then.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
We'll be exploring some intriguing details, like the clauses about fish weirs and the rights of widows, which might seem like something from a period drama, but they're connected to legal concepts that we still deal with today.
I'm especially curious about that famous line, "No free man is to be taken or imprisoned." I mean, that sounds like a cornerstone of any modern legal system, right? Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the very first section of the document.
Well, the document opens by declaring that the English church is to be free and to have all its rights and liberties.
It jumps right into that, huh? Was that a big deal back then?
It was a huge concession from King John. You have to understand the historical context. There was a major power struggle going on between the church and the monarchy. This clause essentially acknowledged that even the king's power was not absolute.
So it's not just about religion then, it's about setting limits on power. That's a concept we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. And that theme continues as we move into the next few sections, which deal with inheritance, debt, and even widows' rights.
Okay, so we're moving from the power of the church to the power of, well, money and family.
Exactly. Sections 2 through 8 lay out specific details about inheriting property and managing debt in the feudal system, for example. It mentions that 100 shillings is the standard relief for a knight's fee.
100 shillings. Can you give us a sense of what that meant back then? Like, what could you buy with that?
Well, it was a considerable sum. A knight could potentially equip himself for battle or acquire a decent amount of land. These clauses aim to protect heirs and prevent powerful lords from taking advantage of them during inheritance.
It sounds like they were trying to bring some fairness and stability to the system, even back then.
Exactly. And believe it or not, we can see elements of these principles in modern inheritance law, ensuring a smoother transfer of wealth and preventing exploitation.
That's a fascinating connection. Okay, what about the widows? The document mentions that they get 40 days of residence and a third of the land, so they couldn't just be kicked out after their husband died.
It was a limited form of protection for sure, but groundbreaking for the 13th century. This laid the foundation for the concept of dower rights, which, while varying in specifics, exist in many legal systems today. It established that a widow had certain claims to her deceased husband's property.
So even though it might seem outdated now, it was a step towards recognizing the rights of women. In a very patriarchal society.
Absolutely. And as we move into sections 9 through 17, we start to see the Magna Carta address the legal system itself.
Oh, so we're moving from personal matters
Yeah,
to the broader structure of law and order.
precisely. These sections cover things like the liberties of the City of London and establishing that common pleas should be held in a fixed place.
So instead of the king just deciding everything on a whim, they're creating a more organized, structured approach to justice.
Exactly. And this is a crucial step towards the concept of rule of law, which is so fundamental to modern democracies.
It also sounds like a direct challenge to the king's absolute power. Was he happy about that?
Well, let's just say it was a point of contention. There's even a clause in there about bridges. No one could be forced to build them unless it was their traditional duty.
I can only imagine getting a notice like, hey, you, go build a bridge for the king.
While it might seem amusing now, that clause reflects the Magna Carta's overall goal of defining and limiting what the government could demand from its people. It's an early attempt to protect individuals from arbitrary demands.
It's interesting how they were already wrestling with that balance between the power of the state and the rights of individuals, even back then.
Absolutely. And that tension is still with us today, in many different forms. Speaking of individual rights and protections, let's move on to sections 18 through 22, which focus on property rights, and limits on what could be seized for debts.
So even if you owed someone money, they couldn't just take everything you owned.
Well, they could seize property, but even then there were rules. For example, it mentions leaving reasonable portions for wives and children.
So even in debt collection, there was an attempt to protect basic needs. Is that a concept that carried forward into modern law?
It certainly did. We see it in things like exemptions in bankruptcy law, where certain assets are protected, and in laws against excessive garnishment of wages. It's the idea that even in debt, There are limits to ensure basic human dignity.
That makes sense. It sounds like a balance between creditors' rights and debtors' basic needs. What else stands out in this section on property rights?
There's a clause about taking timber for castles. Imagine being forced to give up your trees for some royal construction project.
Yeah, I don't think that would fly today.
It wouldn't. And that clause connects to the modern concept of eminent domain, which is the government's right to take private property for public use.
Right, but with the crucial emphasis on fair compensation, which evolved from these early ideas. It seems like we're seeing a pattern here, right? The Magna Carta planted the seeds for so many legal principles we take for granted today.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting as we move into sections 23 through 29, which deal directly with freedom, justice, and individual rights.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. I'm especially curious about the section on fish weirs. Why were they such a big deal that they needed to be in the Magna Carta?
Believe it or not, fish weirs were a way for powerful people to control waterways and block trade. In the 13th century, rivers were vital transportation routes and sources of food.
So this wasn't just about fishing, it was about economic fairness.
Precisely. This clause aimed to prevent monopolies and ensure everyone had a fair shot at using these waterways. It connects to modern ideas like antitrust laws and regulations designed to prevent unfair competition.
Wow, I never would have guessed that fish weirs had such deep implications. So from fish weirs to economic fairness. What else is in this crucial section about freedom and justice?
Well, this is where we encounter the most famous clause of all, Clause 29. It states, and I'll quote it directly, "No free man shall be taken or imprisoned or disseised of his free tenement or of his liberties or free customs or outlawed or exiled or in any way ruined, nor will we go against such a man or send against him save by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land."
Now that's a powerful statement. It sounds like the very foundation of due process and habeas corpus, those cornerstones of legal systems around the world. But what did those concepts actually mean back then? Freemen probably didn't apply to everyone, right?
You're absolutely right. Freemen primarily referred to land-owning men, not women, serfs, or the vast majority of the population, and their legal system was very different from ours today.
So even though it was a groundbreaking declaration, it was still very much a product of its time.
Absolutely. And its interpretation has evolved significantly over the centuries. But even with those limitations, Clause 29 planted a powerful seed. The idea that even the king couldn't just lock someone up on a whim, there had to be a legal process, a judgment by one's peers, or according to the established law.
It's amazing how much of what we consider basic rights can be traced back to that one clause.
It's a testament to the enduring power of those ideas, and we'll explore that further as we continue our deep dive into the Magna Carta.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Magna Carta. We've already uncovered some fascinating connections between this 13th century document and the legal principles we still live by today.
That's right. And in this part, we're going to delve even deeper into how those seemingly ancient clauses have resonated through history, shaping not just laws, but also power dynamics and social structures.
Okay, so we're moving beyond just the text itself
Yeah.
and looking at its broader impact. Where do we start?
Well, let's revisit those sections dealing with inheritance and debt, specifically clauses 2 through 8. We talked about the 100 shillings relief for a knight's fee. But what's really fascinating here is how these clauses shifted power dynamics within the feudal system.
Okay, so we're not just talking about money. We're talking about who had the power to control that money.
Exactly. Remember, under feudalism, land equaled power. The king granted land to barons, who in turn granted smaller portions to knights in exchange for loyalty and military service.
Right, it was all about a hierarchy of land ownership and obligation.
Precisely. And these clauses in the Magna Carta, by setting limits on what could be demanded during inheritance, actually chipped away at the power of those at the top of the pyramid.
So it wasn't just about protecting individual heirs. It was about redistributing power,
Yeah.
even if in a small way.
Exactly. It forced those in power to acknowledge the rights of those below them. And that's a significant shift. And it wasn't just about inheritance. Clauses like the one prohibiting excessive fines for minor offenses also aimed to prevent those in power from exploiting the legal system for personal gain.
So it was about bringing some fairness and balance
Yeah.
to the system as a whole. But even with these attempts at fairness, wasn't the system still heavily biased toward the elite?
It was, remember, concepts like free man and judgment of his peers didn't apply equally to everyone. But what's important is that the Magna Carta planted the seeds for later legal reforms and sparked debates that continue to this day.
So even though it didn't achieve perfect equality, it set a precedent for challenging unjust systems. and demanding greater rights.
Exactly. And those debates over fairness and equality are still very much alive when we look at modern economic systems. Think about monopolies and antitrust laws, which we touched upon when discussing the clause about fish weirs.
Right. That clause was about ensuring access to vital waterways
Yeah.
and preventing any one person from controlling them for their own profit.
Exactly. And today,
Yeah.
we have entire legal frameworks dedicated to preventing monopolies, ensuring fair competition, and protecting consumers from unfair practices.
So even though we're not worried about medieval fish weirs anymore, the underlying principle of economic fairness is still very much relevant.
Absolutely. And that's what makes studying the Magna Carta so fascinating. It allows us to see the roots of these modern debates and understand how those core principles have evolved over time.
Okay, so we've seen how the Magna Carta impacted power dynamics within the feudal system and laid the groundwork for concepts like economic fairness. But didn't it also lead to some pretty major political upheaval? I mean, did King John just accept these limitations on his power without a fight?
Not exactly. The Magna Carta wasn't a magic solution that instantly created peace and harmony. In fact, it was just the beginning of a long and complex struggle for power between the king and the barons.
So it was more like a first step on a very bumpy road.
That's a great way to put it. Almost immediately after it was signed, both King John and the barons started trying to find ways around its provisions. John even appealed to the Pope, who declared the Magna Carta invalid.
Wow, so it really did shake things up.
It absolutely did, and things got even more turbulent. When the barons, feeling betrayed by the king, launched a rebellion, leading to a civil war.
So the Magna Carta wasn't just a document, it was a catalyst for major political change.
Precisely. And while the immediate aftermath was chaotic, the Magna Carta had planted a powerful seed. The idea that even the king was subject to the law, that there were limits to his authority, this resonated with people.
So even though it didn't solve all the problems right away, it changed the conversation about power and governance.
Exactly. It became a symbol of resistance against tyranny and a touchstone for those demanding greater rights and freedoms. It was reissued and reconfirmed by later kings, and its principles were gradually incorporated into English common law.
So it wasn't just a one-time event. It was the start of a long process of legal and political reform.
Precisely. And that's why it continues to be studied and debated today. It reminds us that the struggle for liberty and justice is ongoing, and that those rights we often take for granted were hard-won over centuries.
It also makes you wonder how those early interpretations of the Magna Carta might shape our understanding of similar debates today. For example, we talked about how free man didn't apply to everyone back then.
That's a great point. It raises important questions about how we define those fundamental rights and freedoms in our own time. Who is included? Who is excluded? And how do we ensure that those principles of justice and fairness are truly applied equally to all?
Those are definitely questions worth pondering. And it makes me even more curious about how those ideas from the Magna Carta traveled across the Atlantic and influenced the development of American law and thought. I guess that's where we're headed next.
You got it. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore how those seeds planted in 13th century England blossomed into some of the core principles of the American legal and political system.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring the Magna Carta, tracing its journey from medieval England to its surprising relevance in the modern world.
That's right. And in this final part, we're going to bring things a little closer to home by exploring how the Magna Carta influenced the development of American law and thought.
Okay, so we've already seen how it shaped English law and how it sparked those debates about power, rights, and justice. But how did this medieval document cross the Atlantic and end up influencing the United States?
It's a fascinating example of how ideas can travel through time and space, shaping entire legal systems and cultures. Remember, the American colonists were deeply influenced by English common law, which, over centuries, had absorbed many of the principles of the Magna Carta.
So even though they were breaking away from England, they brought those core ideas of liberty and limited government with them.
Exactly. Think about it. When the colonists were drafting their own founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, they drew inspiration from those same principles that they inherited from English law.
So we're talking about things like due process, protection against unlawful imprisonment, limits on government power, the right to a fair trial. Those sound pretty familiar.
They should. Those are all ideas that are enshrined in the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. You could say that the Magna Carta is like a distant ancestor of American freedom.
It's like it's woven into the very fabric of American law. But are there any specific examples of how the Magna Carta has been directly invoked or applied in U.S. history.
Absolutely. One of the most famous examples is the case of Somerset v. Stewart in 1772. It involved a slave named James Somerset, who had been brought to England from Virginia.
Okay, I'm already sensing a legal showdown brewing.
You're right. Somerset's lawyers argued that slavery was incompatible with English law, specifically citing those principles of freedom and liberty enshrined in the Magna Carta.
Wow, so they used a document from over 500 years earlier to argue for the abolition of slavery.
They did, and it was a landmark case. The English court ruled in Somerset's favor, declaring that slavery could not exist on English soil.
So the Magna Carta actually played a role in the fight against slavery.
It was a significant factor, yes. And this isn't just a historical footnote. The principles of the Magna Carta continued to be cited in cases dealing with civil rights and liberties throughout U.S. history.
Can you give us some more recent examples?
Certainly, during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, activists fighting for equal rights frequently invoked the Magna Carta. They saw it as a powerful symbol of the struggle against oppression and a reminder that even those in power are bound by the law.
It's incredible to think that this document from medieval England could have such a profound impact on such a different time and place.
It speaks to the enduring power of those core ideas: freedom, justice, and the rule of law. They transcend cultural and historical boundaries.
So we've seen how the Magna Carta influenced the foundations of American law and how it was used in those landmark legal cases. But did it have an impact beyond the legal realm? Did it influence American culture in any way?
Absolutely. Its emphasis on individual liberty and limited government resonated deeply with Americans throughout their history, shaping their political thought and cultural identity.
So it's not just about legal technicalities then. It's about core American values.
Exactly. Think about it. The Magna Carta has become a symbol of American freedom. It's often cited by politicians, activists, and everyday citizens to express that fundamental American belief in individual rights and the limits of government power.
It's almost like shorthand for saying we have rights and the government can't just do whatever it wants.
You got it. It encapsulates that essential tension between individual liberty and the need for a just and ordered society, a tension that is still very much at the heart of American political discourse.
This has been an incredible journey. I started out knowing a little bit about the Magna Carta, but now I see it in a whole new light.
It really makes you realize that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about ideas. And those ideas have a way of shaping the world in ways we might not even realize.
It's also a powerful reminder that those rights and freedoms that we often take for granted weren't just handed to us. They were fought for and debated for centuries.
Well said. And it reminds us that the conversation about liberty and justice is never truly over. It's an ongoing process of interpretation, debate, and action.
It's a legacy we're all part of, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. And who knows how future generations will interpret the documents and decisions we're making today.
Well, that's a thought-provoking note to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Magna Carta. We hope you'll continue exploring these ideas and questioning how the past shapes the